Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. If you didn't catch that, soon there will be news about it. So Google it or yeah. I'm Michelle Meow. And for those who are joining us for the very first time, you've never been here, don't know about the program, my program here at the club is your A through Z, covering the LGBT, LMNOP, and everyone in between. So, Jeff, thanks for being in between there somewhere. So our guests, I'll do a proper introduction as soon as the other Jeff arrives, but our first Jeff doesn't really need that much of an introduction. And instead of doing the whole formal, author, activist, we'll just chat a little bit and get to know you. Today, we are going to talk about the golden screen, the movies that made Asia America, that made us, especially those who identify in the AAPI community here. But yeah, first, you.
First of all, Michelle, thank you so much for having me back here. This is the second time I've been on this stage. I was here with several Phils last time for Rise, the prior book that I did. And now we're going to try to repeat the magic with multiple Jeffs. And for now, the backup Jeff sitting here is the only one on stage. But the Bay Bridge is tough, and I think he'll be here hopefully any minute. But yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here in San Francisco. It's such a pleasure to be talking with you. And it's such a pleasure to be talking about this book too. This is kind of a culmination of a lot of different passions. I've watched movies since, movies were kind of the thing that formed me, as I think many of us can say similarly. There was this moment, the first time that I really sort of saw someone who looked like me, who reflected me, larger than life on screen, was when I had this sort of slightly disreputable uncle who was supposed to be taking care of me when my parents were working, who would instead sneak us out to Chinatown. And we'd go down to the Music Palace and watch these double features with, gangsters answering pagers, old women eating dried squid. Everybody was smoking except me, including my uncle. And I'd be watching these double features of just, action like I'd never seen, romance, people who were aspirational, who were sexy, who were heroic, and who were Asian. And everything else I saw around me on media, on television, and elsewhere didn't have me. I was kind of the empty void at the center of the screen. But this opportunity to see in living color with subtitles, films that represented something that looked like me, that spoke to me, that was something that forged my first sense of realization that, this difference in me was not that different after all.
Let me ask you, so at a young age, were you looking for you on screen?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we all do, right? I mean, there's a sense in which until you see yourself, you don't know yourself. And in the media especially, I mean, I didn't grow up quite like my kids have, where they're facing screens, it feels like, 23 out of the 24 hours of the day, right? But there was definitely a sense in which, in a world where you are in the minority, right? You're just seeking for any kind of acknowledgement, any kind of a sense that you belong. And the media is such a part of that. It's such a way in which we, growing up, we're constantly looking for those glimpses of anything Asian on TV. Call everybody in the room, there's a commercial with an Asian person in it.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, right? We talk about how there's this one ad, it probably is before the time of a lot of people in this audience, but there was this one ad from this laundry detergent called Calgon, right? And it was the first time, I think, me and my sister saw two Asian people speaking English without an accent on screen. The ad basically goes, they're running a laundry because, of course, you have to have some stereotype, right? And a woman comes in and says, "Oh my gosh, how do you get these shirts so clean?" And the man who's, one of the proprietors, the male proprietor says, Ancient Chinese Secret, right? And then the wife leans out and says, honey, we need more Calgon. Ancient Chinese Secret, huh? Right? Is the rejoinder. So after seeing that, me and my sister, every single time my parents said anything to us, we'd always be like, Ancient Chinese Secret. So anyway, there is that aspiration to see ourselves, you know?
Yeah. Were you looking for, this is a question that's personal for me, because when I was growing up, my mom had so many kids. My dad died really early when they arrived here at the United States, and so she kind of had to depend on family to take care of us. So we would go and stay with our cousins, and they were still, just really into movies, TV, dramas from back home, which is Laos, Thailand. And so I would grow up looking for films or, Asians in films from across the pond, even though I'm Asian American.
Right.
So it wasn't until later that I was like, oh, wait, there's a little bit of a difference here. So were you looking for yourself or, Asians in films from outside the United States, inside, or?
I think it was first the visuals, right? Just somebody, almost like a mirror, the images on screen. But I mean, eventually it did make a difference that I had to read those movies, that I didn't understand Cantonese, that the context that was on screen was one that was so very different from my own world. I mean, it took a long time before I think I saw my first film or television, episode where Asian Americans were depicted in the way that our family actually lived. But I do think that that even seeing those Asian images made a big difference for me. I grew up in Staten Island, New York, kind of the whitest part of one of the least white cities in America, and everybody around me. They were taller, they were stronger, they were definitely whiter, and I was an outsider. And there was definitely a sense in which I've just wanted that kind of parasocial acknowledgement, at least that somebody like me deserved to be there. And just even seeing those Hong Kong images, those images from across the pond, as you say, it was something. And I mean, to this day, I feel like, we're in an era where when I was growing up, it was impossible to imagine that people in America would watch movies with subtitles and that they would kind of lean into the idea of just embracing people on screen, characters that looked so different from them, even though that's what I did all my life, right? I mean, we're also always so worried that quote unquote mainstream audiences will flee screaming if they see people of color on screen. But, those of us who grew up with this, that's all we ever saw. But here we are today, and Netflix just did this big data dump. And out of the top 25 most watched series on Netflix, series of films on Netflix, 4 of them are K-dramas. And those are watched subtitled, right? People have changed, but it's not a change that I could have imagined when I was, 11 years old and watching this stuff on screen myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you catch a lot of the earlier films, right, and then we'll get into it. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in this book, and gosh, I have to thank you so much for this, because now I can hand this book down to my niece and my nephew and say, yes, this is all you need to know. This is all the films you need to see. Go see it. Put your phone down. I don't have to do the work. I don't have to tell them when I was growing up, I was watching this film, and it's all here in this book. So thank you so much for this gift. If you catch earlier films, right, and you think about it, I mean, if we watch it now, I think it would trigger us very much. It would make us very upset and angry. Do you remember a moment like that growing up and watching something and you were like, this isn't right? Are you freaking serious? Well,
I will say the very first thing I ever wrote, I wrote for my hometown newspaper, the Staten Island Advance, they pronounce it Advance, not Advance. Back when I was in, I think, junior high school, and there was a movie that came out called Year of the Dragon. Michael Cimino movie, set in Chinatown, featured John Lone, Mickey Rourke, and it was all about, Chinatown gangsters, and there was this one line in it, I remember, it's like, this is not New York, this is not even America, this is Chinatown, right? And it basically just carved out this place in New York that was a part of my life. We would go there every weekend. We would eat dim sum. We would be kind of connected to this mothership. And it turned it into this kind of exotic hellhole where life was cheap, and people were just, murdering each other left and right. And of course, white people got in the middle, so people cared. And I remember my parents, when they saw the commercial pop up on TV, they just turned off the TV. It's like, you don't want to see that. And I'm like, why? I mean, I want to understand what's going on here. This is a big movie. It's got some famous people in it, and it seems to have people that look like us in it. And it's like, no, this is not something we want to actually support. And so I snuck out and, ended up seeing it at the mall with friends of mine. And I just remember coming out of there and for the first time feeling threatened, right? Because people were shouting at the screen, and it's Staten Island, which again, this is the West Coast, so maybe, the sort of shouting imprecations at the screen kind of thing is not as common out here, but in Staten Island, in this very kind of, a very white community, lots of young kids or teenagers who were really feeling the film and saying, things about characters on there that felt like they bounced off the screen and aimed back at me. And I ended up actually writing an op-ed about this experience. I didn't think of it as an op-ed, but I just wrote this letter to the editor of the local paper, and they printed it, and it was my first published thing. My first sort of work of cultural criticism, I guess, but mostly about just feeling very unsafe in this space where I was the only person of color, and certainly the only Asian American, in a film that seemed as if it was targeting us. So, and I think we have another Jeff in waiting.
Everyone, Jeff Chang.
How you doing? So good to see you.
Hi, Jeff.
How are you?
Yes. Oh, he's great. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Jeff and Jeff. Okay, I was going to do this at the intro, but we're looking for another Michelle to join us today. Is there another Michelle in the audience?
Sorry.
There's not another Michelle, so I guess I got to exit. It'll be the Jeff and Jeff show. It's great to see everyone. No, Jeff Chang, thank you so much for being here, both of you. We're going to have such a fun time. So while Jeff, you were on your way here, we were just getting to know little Jeff Yang. Almost did it. Little Jeff Yang. So to ease you into the conversation, just very quickly, I mean, what are you watching on Netflix right now?
Should we say? We were there's a Filipino cooking themed show that we've been watching the last couple of nights. I've already forgot the name. Was it? There it is. Replacing Chef Chico, which is horrible. It's really bad. But it's one of those things where you know how you get into it and you've jumped in the water and the tide is sweeping you out. And so we've been binging that.
But it's on the top 10.
It is, which is amazing, right? It's kind of cool for like the right to be mediocre, right?
It's, honestly, we'll probably get into this later, but the right to be mediocre. It is good that we can have like filling comfort food, and not everything has to be haute cuisine. It doesn't all have to win awards. We can just sort of sit there, kind of like get hypnotized, all good.
Yes.
Well, we're here tonight to, go through the golden screen, the movies that made Asian America, and then, great, to have both of you here. Then we'll talk a little bit about what you're working on and the importance and contributions both of you have made, to pop culture, and also highlighting the work that we have all done and the progress of Asian Americans in general. But Jeff Yang, why don't you tell us a little about Golden Screen, how you put it together, and kind of how, you separate it into different chapters, which I understand is concepts, and you bring up all these films within those concepts, and then they end with a beautiful interview that sums it all up with amazing AAPI producers, actors, innovators, all of that.
So, I mean, this is a book that I started writing a little too soon after we finished Rise. I mean, I got a call actually from the editor of the book, Xander Kim, and he basically said, I've been looking for somebody to write a book that kind of celebrates this moment we're in, where Asian American film feels like it's having a moment. And, he had heard that I was a guy who could do that. And I said, look, sign me up. You don't even have to explain any further. I'm there. If you need a book like this, I can write this book. And then we had to actually get down into what the book was going to look like. And so I proposed the title, The Golden Screen. Obviously, it's the pun on the silver screen, but it also acknowledges the fact that this moment that we're in is one where we don't feel like we should be in second place anymore, right? I mean, we deserve a little gold, right? And it was on the heels of, we'd seen Parasite, kind of breaking through that first boundary, and then Everything Everywhere All at Once crashing the stage and getting, I mean, who could have ever imagined that the most awarded film in all of cinematic history would be an Asian American film by, like that combined every genre and, was a little indie film that just destroyed every expectation. But the question of what the book was going to be still sort of hinged on this idea of, like, do we want a book that's going to appeal to cineasts? Is it going to be a history of Asian American cinema, or is it going to be something else? And I said, I'm actually more interested in writing a book that's about not creators, but about the audience. Because as we were talking about earlier, I talked a little bit about my childhood and how movies really kind of first shaped me. The first place I saw Asians on any kind of screen was at the Music Palace in Chinatown in New York. And movies are just a special thing. I feel like, I've said this before, but when you're in a movie theater, you have this kind of weird moment where as the lights go down, it's dark. You see no one else around you. You're just staring at the screen. It feels like you're in this like cocoon. It's a very singular experience. And your relationship with the screen is individual. What you're seeing, what you're experiencing is in your head, in your eyes, in your seat. But then there are moments where everybody in the house laughs, where everybody goes, ooh, where everybody screams because something has broken through that cocoon. And all of a sudden, you realize you're part of an audience, part of a group. And then there's this final moment when you walk out into the lobby and everyone's talking about the film. You're looking at each other. You're even kind of going up to strangers and saying, yeah, I love that scene too. Mm-hmm. And you realize you're part of a community. And for me, realizing that I was part of an Asian American whole was very much like that. I grew up in this very, again, suburban white experience. I realized there were other people because I encountered them through media, through, other kinds of collateral connections. But I didn't feel like I was part of an Asian American community until I could walk out into that lobby, so to speak. And that wasn't until college. And so the audience just naturally felt like the thing to center. And so in doing so, each of the chapters kind of focused on a different theme, like family, for instance, or relationships, gender roles, martial arts, all these different things that have kind of made up our cinematic diet. And within each chapter, looks at how those things have evolved over time. That just felt like the right way to do it.
Brilliant. So let's have our discussion in that way. We're going to go through the 8 chapters and the concepts and themes, and then you'll both basically chime in and add your thoughts on the concepts. So the first chapter is Across the Diaspora, and some of the films, I'll just list them out that Jeff included here. Flower Drum Song, A Great Wall, Eat a Bowl of Tea, Forbidden City, USA, Heaven and Earth, Picture Bride, 3 Seasons, Lost in Translation, this is probably like where I kind of start to, jump myself into oh look, there's Asians in the film, but it's not about him. It's kind of about him.
Yeah.
The Grace Lee Project, The Namesake, Journey from the Fall, Soul Searching, Ghost in the Shell, The Problem with APU, Apu, Go Back to China, Lucky Grandma, Tiger Tail, Blue Bayou. And then I'm just going to read this quote, and then we'll open up the discussion. I'm 100% Asian and 100% American, or maybe just 200% bad at math. The quote comes from a talk with Janet Yang and Bao Wen. So let's start with you, Jeff Chang, and let's talk about diaspora and the films that kind of fall into this concept.
I just loved the selection, how you framed it, because from the beginning, it feels very expansive. It feels very much like we're bringing everybody into this, and we're not dealing with these ideas of national borders. Like, we're dealing with thinking about who we are, and who we are always transcends borders, right? So I really like that you're putting the trouble with Apu, with eatable tea, and you're also crossing all of these different types of years and genres and styles and periods. I mean, Eatable Tea is set in San Francisco Chinatown, right? In the 30s or something like that?
Yeah. I think, maybe it's like the late 40s. I think it's
Late
like
40s,
after there was this moment where people who actually served in the military were able to actually, bring people over as wives, and that's kind of a central theme in the actual, in the movie itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's basically about impotence.
Yeah.
For what it's worth. Yeah.
As is the trouble with Apu in a different way.
In a very different way.
But yeah, so I just loved how you from the jump were, and the other thing that I love about it too is the way that you many of you may not know this, but Jeff was one of the pioneers of Asian American journalism in a lot of ways, because in the 80s, started a magazine called A Magazine, which in a lot of ways was like a small version, that was almost like a test run for something you've come to hear all these years later. And to see this unfold, have all of our creatives in it, from the folks who are the actors and the writers and the musicians and all of that kind of stuff, to the graphic designers and everything else. It's just it's beautiful. The Golden Screen is
Thank you.
beautiful. Yeah.
It was the very tail end of the 80s, 1989 actually, when I graduated, and then we launched this. I'd been involved with Asian American stuff in college, and we was like, of course, if you ran a magazine in college, you can do it in the real world. There's no difference, right? But there's no student council to fund you in the real world. The difference I think then was in the 90s when we were doing A Magazine and acknowledging that one of the things we wanted to do was bring to life Asian American creativity. There was no internet, right? Yeah. So it's not like you could Google people. It's like, oh, Asians and movies. I'm feeling lucky, right? It was very much like you had to scour everything and cherry pick. And we actually had this big file, which was we called it the Lee file, because it was all the people we thought were Asian, but then when we actually looked closely, they were not Asian. Spike Lee is not Asian. What are you talking about? But
Christopher Lee.
It's like, So
we know many Christopher Lees, of course, but
some are Asian.
Not just Christopher Lee. Yeah.
And I think he did play Asian.
Yes. Thanks to Arthur Dong's incredible work, we know that he wanted to be Asian.
Oh.
Christopher Lee.
Well, who doesn't?
I'm talking about the guy who played Fu Manchu.
Yes.
So, yeah.
But, to your point, I think what A Magazine, which in retrospect was as confusing a name for a magazine as having a conversation between two people whose names are Jeff Ang, right? Just the radical act in some ways of bringing together a whole bunch of people and just saying, oh, look, these are Asians, right? Back then, that was something. Mm-hmm. That act of consolidation or aggregation was something. And similarly, like when you talk about the diaspora, look, we all have very different stories. Our journeys are very different. But when you line them up side by side, you start seeing some similarities. And, the jumping off point of like looking at films of the diaspora is in part to see how those initial place of convergence actually started to diverge as stories started to get more sophisticated and complicated, and they weren't all about like intergenerational strife and that feeling of being lost in America, and that sense of I literally wrote my college essay about this, like being half this and half this, right? That quote about being 100% Asian, 100% American. Well, Bao is like a generation younger than me, right? And when I was growing up, I did feel very much split between having one foot in each world, and writing about that wasn't cliched yet. But now to actually tell people, it's like, oh, my Asian half wants to study, my American half wants to party or whatever. That's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah.
But it got me into college.
Right. And it's still getting people into college.
Well, I'm curious. So by the way, part of the reason why I invited Jeff is because out of the many culture critics of our generation, people who have actually really looked at culture, there are a few people who have inspired me as much with their writing and their lives and the work they do as Jeff. And I think that from the vantage point of the work that you've done in particular, looking at this very broad view of representation and identity and the building of community, I've taken a lot out myself in terms of how to kind of rethink some of the ways that I thought people would naturally sort of hear and understand some of these messages. That communication to groups outside of even Asian America is such an important part of what we do, but it's also the hardest part of what we do in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I've been reminded a lot recently of the need for us not to have to feel like we need to perform all the time for non-Asians, non-Asian Americans, non-Pacific Islanders. And that's partly why I appreciated A Magazine back then, because it's like, no, this is our conversation. Everybody else can tune in if you want to, but it's our conversation. We want to have this conversation. And this particular book and the way that you've done it in so many ways, the in jokes in the like the renderings of the redos of the movies, the do-overs of the movies and all that kind of stuff, as well as like the address is not to other folks, and that feels more important than ever. And so like, again, replacing Chef Chico, like, I just appreciate it because like, yeah, like I'm in it. I feel like I'm in that, and it doesn't have to be, a super deep thing or anything. I'm happy not to have to feel like I need to prepare myself like I'm walking out the door and getting out into that world. I could just be like having, some good food and watching folks make good food, and they could work on their scripts, but
it's another standard Netflix program or something that you never mind. Wait, no, although we've made a lot of progress, right? From some of those earlier films that we called out, and then some of these great successes that we're experiencing, huge year, right, for AAPIs in cinema. There's still some things that kind of pop up in that we talk about. It's controversy we need to work on. For example, Ghost in the Shell. I'd love for you to, both of you, to add, your thoughts on when others tell our stories. I mean, aren't we over the day and age in which, it's the white narrative about Asian experiences or I'm still trying to kind of grasp what I think about white characters or white people playing Asian characters. Well, that's still happening though.
It's very complicated, right? I mean, so Ghost in the Shell, for those of you who know kind of the deeper sort of backstory around both the movie and how it made it to American screens. I mean, it's originally a manga, which turned into an anime, so it's like Japanese creativity. And it's very much set in Japan, right? In a diverse Japan, but Japan nevertheless. And its central figure, the female protagonist at the core of it, is Motoko Kusanagi, a Japanese woman. But most of the series is about the blurring of lines, not between human races, but between man and machine, between artificial and human intelligences and the like. And because like in Japan, things are just like default Japanese, right? Even when you have characters with pink or blue or blonde hair, it's like there's no reason to assume that they're not Japanese. But as soon as things actually get remade by Hollywood, consumed and then, ejected into the pop consciousness of America, other factors come into play. And one of them is, well, we're going to spend a lot of money to make this big cyberpunk, narrative. We're going to have to get a star, right, that people can recognize and that can open box offices. And at the time of Ghost in the Shell becoming a Hollywood movie, really there were very few female stars, much less Asian American. There was perceived to be no Asian American female stars who could open a film, right? And that whole notion of star power, I think, is problematic for any number of reasons, which we can talk about, because the whole notion of somehow stars making Hollywood is bankrupt, right? Hollywood makes stars. Hollywood can take anybody and make them a star if they give them the right space to be a star in. The reason we don't have Asian American stars, or didn't at that time, is because Hollywood never bothered to give Asian American stars, especially Asian American women, the chance to shine at the center of a narrative like this. So this was a chance for that, right? But instead they got the closest thing to Asian that was not Asian, which is Scarlett Johansson, right? And she'd already kind of like had an interesting career around this sort of stuff. She kind of broke through with Lost in Translation, also in the book, and we talk in the book about how that movie also is this narrative of like, using a backdrop of Tokyo, yet again, present at the time Tokyo, not future Tokyo, as just a backdrop for the psychodrama of its protagonists who were white. And this did kind of the same thing, except with a story that was inherently a Japanese work to begin with. So I think a lot of people actually were pretty, understandably just like, why did you do this? Yeah. And the movie was a flop anyway.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the thing that's new, right? Because like if you look at the arc of Asian Americans in cinema, I mean, this happened to Anna May Wong, right? With The Good Earth. She was passed over for the lead because they couldn't see beyond her playing a villain. And a deeply sexualized villain at that, right? So she literally is like, all right, forget this. I'm going to go to China, and I'm going to kind of rally my folks around this, and I'm also going to go on this deep dive, kind of into my own identity. And she kind of got the last laugh in some ways because she was able to get a newspaper column with the New York Herald Tribune where she could write about this journey. It's like one of the first pieces of Asian American literature, and Yun Tae Wong writes about this in Daughter of the Dragon, this book that came out this past year on Anna May Wong. But back then she had to leave the country. And now we're just like, no, Scarlett, you're done, and it was over. And so the fact that like we can lead confidently here in an environment, and you and I both come from this, where there are not a lot of prominent Asian American critics in the culture, writ large, like movie, music. I mean, a lot of us that are doing it came up through hip hop because literally black women editors gave us a chance. Right. But there aren't too many of us out there. And so to be able to now do that, I think that's the huge shift.
Well, it's interesting just to note how many ways in which gender politics, sexual politics, the politics of intersectionality shape even stories like Anna May Wong's, and obviously ultimately like Scarlett Johansson's in Ghost in the Shell. In the case of Anna May Wong, right, part of the reason why they didn't want to cast her in Good Earth is because they'd already cast Paul Mooney, right, to play her husband. Paul
Mooney, the late great black comic.
No, Paul Mooney, M-U-N-I. Right.
Muni.
Yeah, Muni, yes.
That's who we see in San Francisco.
Yeah. Paul Bart. No, Paul Mooney. So because the Hays Code made it essentially illegal, not illegal, but verboten, let's just say that, to depict two people of different races having a relationship on screen, right? Something that would not actually be overcome until really like the 50s and 60s. Once they'd cast Paul Mooney, they actually turned to her and said, we understand that you are an actual Chinese person and he is not Chinese, but is playing a Chinese person. But either way, if we were to actually have you on screen, we'd have to cast a Chinese person as your husband. We can't do that because two Chinese people is just too much, right? So they did offer her a role, and the role they offered her was the role of like the concubine, who's kind of the only villainous character in the entire film. And she said, no, hey, I'm Anna May Wong, as she should have. Yes. Meanwhile, if we turn to Ghost in the Shell, right, one of the things that I think was fascinating was the pressure, a lot of it from the internet, a lot of it from cultural critics, right, like ourselves, talking about the problematic optics and reality of casting Scarlett Johansson in this role, a role that had so much opportunity if they did cast an Asian woman. One of the things they ended up doing was they changed the script. And they changed the script in such a way that they actually included this sort of skin changing in the plot of the story. That Motoko Kusanagi is an actual Japanese woman originally, but they kind of extracted her identity and dropped her into a white body as part of the plot of the movie, which is even more preposterous at some level. Like, I would have rather she was just like Scarlett Johansson, frankly. So it's stuff like that which complicates a lot of what we do when we talk about representations, right? It's not just what's on screen, it's what's off screen. It's what people do in response to what they see on screen that actually makes up the stories.
Hollywood's so weird. By the way, audience, we want your questions and your feedback, so we're going to open that up in just a few minutes. So if you've got a question, be ready for the mic. It's John in the back here. We'll be walking around with it. So I actually now need to kind of skip around because of our time, but that's okay because everyone get the book and you'll enjoy it as much as I have. So we'll go to chapter 3, Fists of Fury and Fury. Sorry, sometimes you got to go from the Castro to here. I'm gonna.
Thank you, Michelle.
I saw that.
I can only say that.
Yes.
On this stage, at least. Okay, I'm going to go through some of these films. And I have to say, I love this chapter, by the way. Thank you so much for it, because there was once upon a time I was like, yeah, not another Asian person doing Kung Fu. But now I'm like, why not? Keep them coming. Because every single Kung Fu movie I've ever seen has been the best. It's been the greatest. I've never not loved it. Like, for example, Seven Samurai, Come Drink With Me, Enter the Dragon, duh. They Call Me Bruce, The Karate Kid, A Better Tomorrow, Dragon, The Bruce Lee Story, The Matrix, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, my favorite. Ong Bak, The Thai Warrior, Kung Fu Hustle, Ip Man, The Raid, Redemption, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, The Paper Tigers, Mortal Kombat, Snake Eyes, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and Triple R. So, anything worth doing is Kung Fu. That is a quote from the interview with Ronnie Chung and Daniel Wu.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and also part of your new work that's coming up. Why don't we start there?
Sure. I love this chapter as well. I didn't know about RRR. I have to find out about.
You gotta watch
RRR.
It's Telugu work, right? But it's one of the most just striking and kind of brain melting works that I've seen in a long time. And while the fight scenes are great, the central, I mean, you may have seen this actually, I think, in the Oscars last year, but the central conflict resolution actually isn't with fists. There's a dance-off that completely ends up as becoming this moment of like brown supremacy at the center of this movie. So definitely watch for that. I think it's available on Netflix.
It's a Kung Fu musical, or it's a martial arts musical?
It's a martial arts Tollywood film that kind of tells this historical story, but fantasizes it as one does, and then just makes its central characters larger than life, which I think actually martial arts is frequently does. Like martial arts leans into historical narratives and then takes those historical characters in many cases or situations and then magnifies them and then fills them with fisticuffs. And look, when I was growing up, these are the first superheroes that I actually ever saw and came into contact with.
Yeah, for sure.
And you're in the progress right now of writing a book about Bruce Lee and quote unquote the making of Asian America, which I'm fascinated by. We haven't talked yet about the thesis of the book, but for me, it's like I can see it already.
Yeah, it's a weird kind of bio. We're calling it a cultural biography. It's kind of a dual biography about the rise of Bruce Lee and the rise of Asian America. So there's hundreds of books. I have, Lourdes will tell you, I have hundreds of books on Bruce Lee, hundreds of magazines, way too much, and very few of them actually look at Bruce as an Asian American, which he was quintessentially that. And this is sort of, I think, the point of your podcast, right? They call us Bruce.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's a way to kind of understand Asian America by looking at Bruce's story. So, immigration, self-defense, especially in this moment, has become so crucial to us in so many different types of ways. How we are all actually here because of war and imperialism and colonialism, all of that stuff. So I'm able to kind of take Bruce's story as the spine and go back to talking about immigration and move forward to 2020, 2021, 2022 as well, and talk about all those kinds of issues and questions. And it's just been so much fun to be able to do. I was going to say because you both brought it up, is sort of this idea of Bruce Lee as his stereotype, right? And knowing that on the one hand, they call us Bruce to make fun of us, right? To mark us as outsiders, but they also call us Bruce when we're badass. So it's this double-edged kind of thing, and I feel like, in part, to be able to kind of see a movie like, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and see martial arts alongside this family drama, alongside this this sort of Michelle Yeoh's playing a loser, right? Yeah. She's about to lose the business. She's about to lose her husband. She's about to lose her daughter.
That's how you know she's an amazing actor, right?
Absolutely.
That she can play a loser. That Michelle Yeoh can play a loser.
Right? But flipping it and then being able to add all of this and show the deep and broad humanity that is us, is what makes the movie so great, I think. So it feels like we're in a moment now where maybe people can actually really see, Bruce for who he is and who he was. And it's weird because we elevate him to be a legend, and I'll shut up after this, but we elevate him to be a legend, but that makes him less human,
right,
in so many ways. And to think about the things that he actually overcome, that he was a war child, you know what I mean? That he was starving and sick, just like all the other war babies that we can talk about today, right? In this very moment, that he went through that he came to the U.S. and lived in segregated neighborhoods, right? That he was treated as lower than low, due to class issues within the Chinese American community, but also obviously due to race. That he went to Hollywood and was the sidekick who had I counted about 10 or 15 words for the whole first season of The Green Hornet, most of which were what do we do now, boss? And from there was able to achieve what he achieved. It's amazing. It's a huge kind of breakthrough, but it's hard for us to see because he's been separated from his humanness. And I think to be able to talk about him as an Asian American recovers that.
I wholly agree, and I've seen the kind of iconography, the sort of beatification of Bruce. I mean, on the one hand, it's great to see people admire and aspire to somebody who was a superstar and a self-invented, self-made superstar. But it's also shocking what that erases. And I'll add a couple things, like to his Asian American identity. He was mixed race, right? His mom was biracial, and as a result, he actually was in Hong Kong. He had to defend himself. He fought kids, and eventually part of the reason he got sent to the United States because he was getting into a lot of fights. And part of the reason was because people saw him when he was younger as an outsider, even in Asia. So that whole sort of outsider there, outsider here thing, man, that's something a lot of us have, I think, experienced as Asian Americans. Then here's the other layer. So his name actually is Lee Junfan, right? Which is, it's actually traditionally a feminine name, a female name. And, the reason why he was given that was because, there was this whole thing about this perception of a family curse that would strike down eldest sons and everything. Oh my God, let's not get into all that. But he did have to, again, grow up with a name that was traditionally a woman's name. And it was another reason to bring out his fist sometimes. And I think of myself in my own playgrounds in Staten Island, again, not the kindest neighborhood in the world. In some ways, the Bruceness of it all was like a weird armor when I needed it, right? There was always that sort of suspicion out of the corner of bullies' eyes that maybe I could bring something out, right? I don't know any martial arts, but maybe I do, That sort of, idea that Asians everywhere have this secret weapon that if you just trigger them too much, out comes the fanny pack, Yeah. That's it's something which, it was a weapon. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I think martial arts movies are such an amazing lens through which to see ourselves in some ways, right? It is our superheroes, but it's also, martial arts movies aren't really about superheroes in the Superman sense. They're really more of those superheroes in the kind of Peter Parker sense, you're not saving the world with your fist, you're saving your brother, you're saving your school. It's a local friendly neighborhood martial arts superhero, right? And most of the time you start out as losers and you train your ass up. You go through the training cycle to become a hero. So it's always been about giving people who are marginalized this additional layer. And that actually brings up this other point of martial arts being actually one of the conversations that always existed between the Black and the Asian American communities, because the first people to really embrace martial arts cinema were urban audiences, Black audiences in cities where they saw martial arts as literally an opportunity to, both figuratively and literally, I guess, see self-strengthening, see a way to actually control, things that felt out of control. And to this day, most of the people who I have had the most wisdom dropped on me, around both martial arts as an activity and martial arts cinema have been African American.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so resilience. I mean, growing up, I had told people I was Chinese just so that everybody would just think I'm cool, because it was the Bruce Lee effect. And it was who's Chinese? Bruce Lee. Don't mess with me.
Now we all got the Korean then.
Yeah, now
I am BTS. I was
now even I get to claim a little bit of that through Lisa and Blackpink. Yeah, we're all related. John, we'll kind of go to you and any questions from our audience. Or questions, comments, chime in.
Do we have a question for our speakers?
All right, we'll keep going. Yeah, I mean, again, don't be shy if you do want to just pop your hand up. We'll keep going with our chapters here. I'm gonna go to social studies. Yeah, and some of the films that you cover here: The Good Earth, Chan is Missing, Gandhi, My Beautiful Laundrette, Gung Ho, The Last Emperor, Who Killed Vincent Chin, Children of Invention, Slumdog Millionaire, Twinsters, Gook, Crazy Rich Asians, Minding the Gap, American Factory, Parasite, Yellow Rose, and Minari. The quote here that you pulled out: you have to trace the scars. Not to get super serious, but I don't think we can leave this conversation without covering those scars?
I think that, I mean, it was a complicated chapter to put together because it spans so much. I mean, this was really about kind of the cinema of social issues, about films that really delved more deeply into, the world that we live in and where we fit into it. And some of them are narratives, some of them are documentaries, some of them are, kind of epic, so biopic stories, and others are intimate stories of individuals struggling in social conditions that these films, in many cases, lift up. I think that the reason why I wanted to include this as a dimension to explore is because for the longest time it felt like there were only a few genres in which Asian Americans could play, in films that were targeting wider audiences, right? There was sort of the family dramas, intergenerational strife and all that, the Joy Luck Club and things after it that followed the same route. And then there were stories that, generally sidelined Asians either as victims or as sidekicks or as buffoons. But stories, especially that talked about these deeper, more quote unquote serious issues, right? These were stories that I think for the longest time, people didn't really take stories coming out of our community, turning the camera around and looking at, either our communities abroad or here in America with that same sort of depth of seriousness. I remember, watching films like The Last Emperor and thinking, oh my gosh, it's like this spectacle, They have thousands of people on screen. It's this historical, drama that focuses on kind of the end of a chapter in Chinese history. And of course, it was directed by Bernardo Bertolucci. And, while it was a truly it was a spectacle, right? It was hard for me to connect to it because it was things seen from the outside as opposed to from the inside. I wanted to know more about, what happened to the people, not just the emperor, but, in this convulsion of Chinese history. What happened to ordinary people at that time? Where did, people who were the, let's say, ancestors of my friends flee to during this time when there was a revolution occurring in China, when dynasties were falling? Those weren't the stories that anybody wanted to tell. People wanted to tell these big stories, big budget stories that could look like period costume dramas. And, it took a while for us to be able to kind of move around to a point where smaller, but just as intimate and just as important stories from an Asian American centered or an Asian even centered perspective could be told. So, the other thing that I felt was important to bring up here is in the context of documentaries, which have been such a huge part of Asian American filmmaking. Who Killed Vincent Chin, right, by Renee Tajma Pena, a good friend of both of ours, who we've collaborated with, each of us individually, and Christine Choi. That film was more than just a work on screen. It was arguably a work that it kind of sparked a movement, right? It was the first time that people actually saw for themselves the fire that built in Detroit, Michigan, the interracial, the sort of pan-racial coalition of peoples who gathered together to fight for justice for an Asian American person who had been unjustly killed. And it didn't just kind of enrage people, it motivated them and inspired them for the first time to really kind of take a serious look at what it meant to be Asian in America. And that's what movies in, I think, this chapter do. They're the movies that actually try to move people beyond what happens in the seats. They're the movies that want to take you through the lobby and out into the streets and say, you know what you saw should change you, should motivate you, should force you to do something beyond just watching. So that's what this chapter is about. But this is stuff that you've been kind of elbows deep in. You've been kind of much more focused on history and telling our history and kind of the history of various communities than I have. And even in the work that I think you did with Renee herself, the Solidarity Project you did, I was just very strongly inspired by this idea that we could use images on screen to actually motivate people to change their behaviors towards one another.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we did a project called the May 19th Project, which is the shared birthday of Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama. And out of that, we commissioned almost a dozen pieces, short stuff to live on social media and also to be used in classrooms, that took different vignettes from history to illustrate everything from Frederick Douglass support for Chinese in America, and the Wong Kim Ark case here in San Francisco, and how that led to us having birthright citizenship, all the way up through the Third World Liberation Front and the strike here in the Bay Area, the strikes here in the Bay Area. But yeah, it just sort of continuing in that path of folks trying to illuminate and spark and inspire. I had a question about why you included Parasite in that list.
I think part of it was that Parasite, it was a much awarded film. It's an incredible film, but it's also a film that's deeply about class, right? And deeply about underclassness. And I think that in an era where a lot of, what people see manifesting from Korea is, it's shiny, it's pretty, it's gorgeous men and women like dancing and singing. And Parasite, with all of the acclaim it got, with all the attention it received, it shows a side of Korea and ultimately a side of I think, all of our societies that a lot of people refuse to really stare at closely. This notion that inequity, that inequality is something that in the very cracks of our society could cause it to come tumbling down. I really love also just, this idea that it was a film that forced us to not look away at the people who we usually step over, if you will. I mean, when I first saw it, I felt exhausted, actually, after watching it. It's incredible work, but it also put me through the ringer of just thinking about the ways in which, I myself was a parasite, in a society where both my privileges and the things I take for granted were made possible only because of the invisible work of so many other people. And, to the extent that it was one of the first films to kind of cross the boundary of, of genre and of language in this present era, and to receive the kind of attention it did, it felt like it felt like an important kind of exclamation point around this whole notion of the cinema of social issues. This is what it looks like when you, as Bong Joon-ho himself said, kind of overcome the 1-inch hurdle of subtitles to see what the rest of the world looks like. And when you look at the rest of the world, maybe you see a little something yourself as well.
We have a question from the audience.
First of all, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm learning so much. So Jeff, as an Asian American growing up in California and then going to college on the East Coast, all that what was in media was really informative because it was kind of part of our self-image. And I work in a career where I work with a lot of Asian Americans, and they are so impacted, and their confidence is so impacted by what's in the media, right? So you guys talked earlier about the stereotypes, then about martial arts, right? Then about, now you have all these things about Asian power. But, it still belies like we're looking for role models, we're looking for things to look up for. I'm just curious, what's next? We've gone beyond, all these young men are working out so they could be buffed like, Shang-Chi, right? Or we're all showing that we have economic power. But like, there's more to us, right? We're not just those tropes, right? There's more to us. So I'm curious, what are the genres that you see coming out next, and how we as the audience, how can we support that? How can we have more nuanced programming come out that features our community in more layers than just those tropes?
Such a great question.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you for that. This summer was really interesting because you had Joyride and Past Lives, Shortcomings, and like the continuing Everything Everywhere All at Once in theaters all at the same time. And I know you wrote about it. I was able to squeeze a little mention into the piece I did on Bruce for the 50th. But that's what's interesting is it felt like this unheralded moment actually for us to be able to kind of see all of these different types of narratives, on screen. Joyride's much different from Past Lives. And so this is what Viet Thanh Nguyen has been talking about, and we were talking about this earlier, the right to be mediocre, right? The idea that we'll have so many stories out there that will represent such a breadth of who we actually are, that we can actually make shows that are not that great and will survive. Really, because there's those of us who are like in the publishing industry are very aware, like, wow, if this book doesn't make it, it's an Asian American novel, or it's an Asian American history of the arts, or it's Asian American this or an Asian American that it might make it harder we're still in that phase. It's been a good sort of last 5 years around publishing for a lot of novelists, but we're always worried that the trapdoor could open up, So I don't know that there's a particular genre. What I'm hopeful is that in the coming, or actually here, backlash that we're seeing, that we'll have had enough networking and structures built up that we'll be able to, level up for, like my kids, who my son just graduated from film school this past year. I'm hopeful that in 5-10 years that they're able to take it up to the next level.
Yeah.
You could talk about your son.
Well, in the context of the right to be mediocre. No, no. He's my son is exceptional in a lot of ways. But I will say he does not feel the pressure to excel the way that I did, right? And it's not because I haven't tried to pressure him. I do. It's like I'm still an Asian dad at the end of the day. My son Hudson was on this show Fresh Off the Boat for 6 seasons, and it was a pretty pivotal moment for Asian American popular culture. But he's a little bit like at this point where like, Dad, I've done a lot. I don't want to work so hard anymore.
Good for you, Hudson.
C's are good enough, man. But
it's our dream, right? That's the dream, right? For our kids to retire at 23.
Yeah, I want to be able to see nothing but C's. Anyway, I do think that there's something to kind of peel back a little bit more. It's not just the right to be mediocre, which I think is important. We should be able to fail. Like we should have the privilege of the safety net that so many other people have gotten. Again, white filmmakers, if their film fails, it does not do anything for the next white filmmaker to come along. People are not saying, no more movies by white filmmakers, right? But all Asians are somehow a hive mind. We're all connected, and anything that one of us does, all of us is responsible for. Something which, again, our friend Phil Yu talks about in the sort of term, the rep sweats, right? We're all perspiring over what the other Asian does on screen. If it screws up, it just poisons the well for the rest of us. And I think it's not just about the right to be mediocre and to fail when we do, and when we do be able to bounce back. It's kind of like the right to be middle brow, right? It's the right to not actually have to be exceptional, not have to win awards, not have to be the model minority on screen or around the screen or behind the screen. And also, I mean, to tell stories that don't feel like they have to work so hard, right? Stories that are smaller, stories that are more intimate, stories that I think of, you know, all of the films out there that get that coveted slot of kind of indie darling, right? And when you read the log line, you're like, who decided this was a film, right? You know, what was that film? The one that you know, was basically just like about Paul Anderson's film about like growing up in the 70s or something. Oh, sorry. Yes. You know, that you read the log line for that, and you're like, this is just you deciding to whatever, throw shit out there. And it's fine. It's perfectly fine. But we should be able to make those films and still have them feel meaningful. We should be able to tell stories about small chapters in our lives, about coincidental connections and chance meetings. And I actually think Past Lives, in a lot of ways, with all the acclaim it's getting, and I think it's winning awards, it will win more. I think that's actually, in some ways, a threshold crossing, because it is the kind of film that doesn't try to boil the ocean. There is no martial arts and science fiction and multiverse and everything. And I love Everything Everywhere All at Once, but it's also a film that kind of threw everything up on screen to make sure that you were constantly just, you know, never going to turn your face away, right? Mm-hmm. Past Lives is quiet. Mm-hmm. It's a small film about two people who intersect and then go apart and then maybe intersect again. And the parts don't quite fit the same way. And just saying that alone, saying that it is this intimate, you know, kind of romantic, not quite romantic drama between two people separated by diaspora, that's not enough. That's not a pitch that anybody's going to open up a wallet for until you actually read the script, until you actually see the performances. You don't realize what a great film it is. And I want us to have that. I want us to be able to just tell small stories with incredibly beautiful effect. It kills me that I had to finish the manuscript for this before writing about Past Lives. Because to me, if that film is successful as I think it will be over the next couple of months, it will truly be a Rubicon crossing for us as Asian Americans.
We'll welcome that Rubicon crossing at some point, and I think even, you know, 2024. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but both of you have been so incredible and amazing. We do have copies of The Golden Screen right outside the door if you don't have a copy yet. Jeff Yang is going to be signing some books, but you can rub shoulders, hang out with both Jeffs, and we have some wine. We even, you know, as mentioned, the boba tea station, right, from Twirl, and then
Thank you,
some
Twirl.
chicken and falafel shawarma, shrimp chips. So stick around, hang out. I want to thank both of you so much because,
Thank you.
You know, thank you for first allowing mediocrity. I get to join the crowd. I might be somebody in 2024. And thank you for all the work and opening doors for all of us. So, Jeff and Jeff, thanks all of you for joining us here at the Commonwealth Club. We'll
Happy
see you
holidays,
next time.
everybody. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.